Okay, let's dive in. Imagine for a moment living in a time where we have just an almost unimaginable amount of information at our fingertips. Everything is available, right?
Right. News from everywhere, deep analysis, different angles.
Streaming video, podcasts, websites, social media, it's all just there, instantly. But here's the wild paradox. In this age of what seems like information abundance, the trust we have in the actual places delivering all this news, it's hitting levels we haven't seen in decades, and not in a good way.
Yeah, it really feels completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
More information, less trust. It doesn't quite add up.
Exactly. And that disconnect is really what we're going to explore today.
We want to dig into the current state of Americans' confidence, specifically in mass media, see how that stacks up against trust in other big U.S. institutions.
And then, maybe most importantly, really try to unpack what our sources tell us about the deep links between that breakdown in media trust and the intense political polarization that, seems to define so much of American public life these days.
It feels like they're really intertwined.
They absolutely do. And to help us navigate this whole complex landscape, we've pulled together some really useful material. It gives us both the hard numbers and some, crucial historical context and real-world examples, too.
Okay, what are we working with?
So our main sources for this deep dive include a recent report from Gallup, specifically their September 2024 poll data. It's titled, "Americans' Trust in Media Remains at Trend Low."
Trend low. Okay.
Yeah. We also have some extensive excerpts from a PBS NewsHour video transcript. That one's called "Exploring the Links Between Political Polarization and Declining Trust in News Media." And it features insights from, everyday Americans, but also experts like Professor Martha Minow from Harvard Law School and Professor Matt Lewandowski, who's a political scientist.
Got it. Experts in real people's perspectives.
And crucially, to give us a sense of how this trust issue plays out with specific news outlets, we're drawing from an AP News article. The title is "Republicans and Democrats Disagree on Media Sources They Trust," survey says. And that one digs into findings from a recent Pew Research Center survey that looked at confidence in, I think it was 30 different news sources.
30 sources. Okay, so we've got the big picture polling, expert analysis, historical context, and then the specifics on individual outlets.
Exactly. So our mission really is to synthesize these different perspectives, these data points. We want to pull out the most essential insights to help you understand just how big this media trust challenge is in the U.S. right now.
And maybe explore some of the key factors that got us here over time.
Yes, absolutely. And critically, shed light on the serious potential implications this has, particularly for our, increasingly polarized political environment and maybe even, for the fabric of society itself.
Okay, so let's start with that big picture from Gallup, because you said the numbers are pretty eye-opening.
They really are. They set the stage. The headline statistic from that September 2024 poll, measuring confidence in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly, it's stark.
What's the number?
Just 31% of Americans reported having a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media.
31%.
Yeah.
Wow. Less than a third.
Yeah, think about that. Less than a third of the country expresses, a meaningful level of trust in the news outlets bringing them information.
And you mentioned it's a trend low, so this isn't just a blip.
Exactly. As the Gallup report emphasizes, this isn't some sudden dip. That 31% figure is, statistically speaking, pretty much the same as the 32% they found in 2023. And it's basically been bumping along this historical bottom since it first hit 32% way back in 2016.
So we're talking nearly a decade hovering at this really low level.
Yeah, it's not a fleeting moment. It feels more like a sustained crisis of confidence.
Okay, what else stood out from that data?
Well, what makes it even more concerning, and maybe the most striking finding from Gallup, is this. For the third year in a row, more U.S. adults actually say they have no trust at all in the media, that's 36%, than say they have a great deal or fair amount of trust combined, which is at 31%.
Wait, so the biggest group isn't some trust or low trust, it's no trust at all.
That's right. That's a critical point to really let sink in. It's not just low trust, it's that outright distrust is the single largest category of response.
And what about the middle ground, people with maybe just a little bit of trust?
Yeah, there's a group there too. About 33% say they have not very much confidence. So if you add that 33% to the 36% with no trust at all.
You're looking at what, nearly 70%? A huge majority of Americans lacking significant trust in the mass media.
Exactly, almost 7 in 10. And to really appreciate just how dramatic this shift is, you need that historical context Gallup provides.
Right, how did it used to be?
Well, when they first started asking this back in 1972, trust levels were consistently high. We're talking ranging from 68% up to 72%.
Wow, like 2/3 or more.
Yeah. And even later, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, smaller majorities, but still majorities between 51% and 55% still trusted the news media.
So dropping from roughly 2/3 trust down to less than a third now, that's a monumental change in what, just over 50 years?
It really is. It completely reshapes the whole information environment people are operating in.
And to put media trust into even sharper perspective, Gallup also asks about confidence in other U.S. institutions, right? Civic, political ones.
They do, and that comparison is really telling for where the media stands.
How's this stack up?
Well, at 31% trust, the news media is the least trusted institution among the 10 that Gallup surveyed.
The very bottom of the list. Ouch.
Yeah.
Dead last.
So what institutions do people trust more?
Well, significantly more, actually. Majorities still express confidence in their local government. That's 67% trust, and state government at 55%. To handle problems effectively.
Okay, so closer to home, more trust. That makes some sense. It does. And interestingly, more than half, 54%, also trust the American people as a whole when it comes to making judgments under the democratic system.
So trust in local and state government and in the collective wisdom of the people is much higher than trust in the national news media. What about, say, the federal branches, Congress, the president, the courts?
Okay, so the legislative branch, that's the U.S. Senate and House, is rated almost as poorly as the media, just 34% confidence there.
So media and Congress are basically tied for last place.
Pretty much. Then you have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, along with men and women in political life, basically candidates and office holders, the federal government's handling of international problems, and the executive branch led by the president. They all fall in this kind of middle range from about 37% up to 48% trust.
Still no majorities there, though.
No, none of those hit 50%. And interestingly, the federal government's handling of domestic problems is the second least trusted category overall at just 37%.
So to recap, media is dead last at 31%, Congress right there at 34%, federal handling of domestic issues at 37%, then the courts, politicians, international affairs, executive branch sort of clustered in the high 30s, low to mid 40s.
That's a good summary. The state and local government and the people are the only ones clearly above 50%.
Was there any good news? Any institution where trust actually went up recently?
Just one. Among those Gallup surveyed this past year, they noted a 6-point increase in confidence in men and women in political life. It went from 37% up to 43%.
Okay, still not great, but an upward tick at least.
Right. While it's still below historical averages, it was, an upward movement compared to the previous year, which kind of stands out in this landscape of generally declining or just stagnant low trust.
And Gallup mentioned historical averages.
Yeah, that's a key point. They note that each of these individual institutional trust levels is below its historical average going back to 1972, and many of them are near their record lows.
So while media trust is particularly abysmal, it's happening within this broader context, this pattern of declining confidence in a lot of major American institutions.
That's right. But the media situation, as you said, it feels uniquely challenging, and partly because of something that just profoundly shapes how we perceive it, which is the partisan divide.
Ah, yes. All our sources seem to hammer this point home.
Absolutely. The Gallup report makes it unequivocally clear. Trust levels are just dramatically different based on political party affiliation. It creates what almost feels like two different realities when it comes to the news.
Okay, give us the numbers. How big is this gap?
It's truly stunning. So among Democrats, 54% report having a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media.
Okay, 54%. Not amazing, but a majority.
Right. Now for independents, just 27%.
Oof, down to about a quarter.
And for Republicans, a mere 12%.
12%. Just
Yep.
12% of Republicans trust the media.
That's what Gallup found. Let that sink in for a second. 54% for Democrats, 12% for Republicans. That's a difference of 42 percentage points in trust towards the exact same set of media entities.
That is a chasm. It's not even close.
Not at all. And the sources indicate that for independents, that 27% matches their record low from 2022. And for both Democrats and Republicans, their current levels are statistically similar to their own historical low points within their respective parties.
So everyone's near their floor, but the floors are in completely different zip codes.
That's a good way to put it. It's worth looking at the recent trend for Democrats, too, though. While their trust is 54% now, it had actually rebounded somewhat after a sharp drop to 51% back in 2016.
Oh, interesting. When did it rebound?
Between about 2017 and 2022, Democratic trust was higher, ranging from 68% up to 76%. But then it fell back to 58% last year and has edged down a bit more this year to the current 54%.
So a bit of a roller coaster for Democrats, but still ending up way higher than Republicans.
Way higher. Republicans' trust, in contrast, has just remained quite low for a longer stretch now. And this massive difference, this magnitude of difference, it's pervasive across many of the institutions Gallup surveyed, not just the media.
Really? Like where else?
Well, the data shows Democrats trust most entities significantly more than Republicans do. We're talking a difference of over 40 points for the executive branch, the federal government handling both international and domestic problems, candidates for office, and, yes, the media itself.
So huge gaps across the board in trust towards government and political figures driven by Tardy?
Huge gaps. The only institution in that Gallup survey where Republicans actually express more trust than Democrats is the judicial branch, the Supreme Court.
Okay, that's the one exception.
Correct. So this partisan split in institutional trust is profound, but it becomes even more vivid, I think, when we look at the actual media sources people are consuming and trusting.
Right, moving from the media in general to specific outlets. The PBS NewsHour transcript had some examples.
It did, and they perfectly illustrate this data. They profile Jerry Leeser, who's a Republican committee woman in Massachusetts. Her media diet is very specific.
Where'd she watch or listen to?
She mentions listening to Fox News and Newsmax and consciously avoiding channels like CNN.
And her reasoning. Why those choices?
Well, as she's quoted, she believes Fox provides a better interpretation of former President Trump's values and political positions, and she feels outlets like MSNBC are, in her words, much more likely to insult Republicans.
Okay, so she's seeking media that she feels, one, aligns with her political views, but also, two, validates her identity and doesn't feel hostile towards her group.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with Demet Hawk. He's a Democrat, an immigrant from Turkey. His viewing habits are quite different.
What does he watch?
He mentions MSNBC, CNN, PBS, and the BBC. And he says he gave up on Fox a long time ago.
And why does he prefer those outlets?
He says he chooses them because, quote, he likes their focus on the issues that are important to me.
So again, alignment with his priorities and perspective. These individual stories are powerful because they really seem to reflect that broader polling data, don't they?
They absolutely do. And as the PBS report notes, these examples aren't unique. They cite a 2023 AP survey which found that while 26% of Democrats have little or no trust in the news media, that number jumps dramatically to 60%, 60 among Republicans.
60% of Republicans with little or no trust. That mirrors Jerry Leeser's perspective.
It does. And another study they reference, a YouGov one from 2024, showed Democrats tend to trust a wider range of sources. Republicans, though, more like Jerry Leeser, are far more concentrated in their trust, often primarily favoring outlets like Fox and Newsmax.
So it's not just about how much trust people have, but the very ecosystem of information they inhabit seems to depend heavily on their political leaning.
Exactly. It's like different information worlds. And this brings us perfectly to that granular data from the AP News article based on the Pew Research Center's survey from mid-March 2025.
Right, the one that looked at 30 specific news sources.
Yes. Pew looked specifically at trust levels for these 30 different sources among Democrats and Republicans. This really helps us map out those different media ecosystems you mentioned.
What did they find? Any sources that bridge the gap?
Well, this Pew data is really illuminating on that front. It highlights just how rare that is. Out of all 30 national and local news outlets they tested, only 2 Forbes and the Wall Street Journal were trusted by more people than distrusted among sympathizers of both parties.
Just 2 out of 30.
Just 2.
Wow. Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. That fact alone tells you just how segmented the media landscape has become, doesn't it?
It speaks volumes. And the imbalance in the sheer number of trusted sources is equally striking. Democrats expressed more trust than distrust in 23 of the 30 sources surveyed.
Okay, 23 out of 30 for Democrats. What about Republicans?
Republicans, on the other hand, only trusted 8 of the 30 sources more than they distrusted them.
8 for Republicans, 23 for Democrats. That's a huge difference. Democrats are drawing from a much wider pool of sources they consider trustworthy.
They are. While Republicans seem to be relying on a much, much narrower selection.
Which specific sources made that short Republican trust list? Were they the ones we expect?
Pretty much. According to the Pew data reported by AP, only 2 sources were trusted by more than 3 in 10 Republicans. Those were Fox News Channel, with 56% trust among Republicans.
Okay, number 1, as expected.
And, maybe surprisingly to some, the Joe Rogan podcast, which was trusted by 31% of Republicans.
Yeah, interesting. Joe Rogan. So Fox News and Rogan are the only 2 clearing 30% trust among Republicans. It's a very concentrated media pattern.
It really is. Now compare that to the Democratic side again.
Where 23 sources were trusted more than distrusted.
Right. And specifically, 13 sources garnered trust levels over 30% among Democrats. The list cited by AP includes the news divisions of the big 3 networks, ABC, CBS, NBC plus PBS, CNN, BBC, The New York Times, The Associated Press, MSNBC, National Public Radio, NPR, USA Today, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal.
Okay, that's a much, much broader spectrum of outlets. Legacy newspapers, public broadcasters, networks, cable news, wire services.
A real mix. This data really hammers home how people on different sides of the political aisle aren't just, interpreting the world differently. They're often starting with fundamentally different sets of perceived facts because they're getting their baseline information from such wildly disparate sources.
They live in different information streams.
Pretty much. And the Pew data further illustrates this by highlighting the sharpest divides for specific outlets. Take the Joe Rogan podcast again, top trust source for Republicans.
Right, 31% trust.
For Democrats, the picture is the complete inverse. 40% distrust it as a news source, with only 3% trusting it.
A total flip.
Yeah.
What about Fox News? Most trusted for Republicans at 56%.
Well, according to Pew, nearly 2/3 of Democrats, around 66%, actively distrust Fox News. Only 19% trust it. Among Republicans, it's almost a mirror image. Only 21% distrust it, while that 56% trust it. The perception is just dramatically different based on party.
Okay, what about outlets often perceived as having more of a liberal tilt, like PBS and NPR? How do they fare?
Good question. For PBS, 59% of Democrats trust it, compared to just 4% who distrust it. So very high trust among Democrats.
And Republicans?
Republicans are much more divided, but they actually lean slightly towards distrust. 23% trust PBS, while 26% distrust it. The difference isn't as extreme as with Fox or Rogan, but that partisan split is definitely clear.
Okay, so a clear partisan gap for PBS. What about NPR?
The Pew data on NPR shows an even more pronounced split. 47% of Democrats trust it, with a tiny 3% expressing distrust.
So again, high trust among Democrats.
Very. But among Republicans, the pattern is reversed again. More than twice as many Republicans distrust NPR than trust it. The AP article actually points out the political context here.
Oh, yeah?
Noting former President Trump's past attempts to eliminate federal funding for both PBS and NPR based on a perceived liberal bias. And this Pew data clearly shows a significant partisan gap in trust for those specific outlets that aligns perfectly with that perception in political battle.
So the data is just unambiguous. Trust in media is low overall, but it's fractured along these deep partisan lines. Very different media consumption, very different trust levels depending on your politics.
Absolutely. But beyond party, the Gallup data also revealed another significant demographic split we should touch on. Age.
Right. Age also plays a role.
Yes, a notable one. The aggregate Gallup data shows a pretty clear 17 percentage point gap in trust between older Americans, those aged 65, and older, 43% of them express trust, and those under age 50, where only 26% trust the media.
So older generations are significantly more trusting of the media than younger ones are. Does that pattern hold true within the political parties as well?
This is where it gets particularly interesting. When you drill down and look at Democrats specifically, there's a massive age divide within the party.
Really? How big?
Huge. Young Democrats, those aged 18 to 29, have far less trust in the media, only 31% confidence compared to older Democrats aged 65 and older, where a striking 74% express confidence.
74% versus 31%. That's a 43-point difference within the Democratic Party based on age.
Exactly. It's almost as big as the total partisan difference we just talked about between Democrats and Republicans overall.
Wow. What could possibly explain such a huge gap among Democrats?
Well, the sources don't explicitly detail the why behind that specific age gap, but we can definitely infer based on the broader discussion. Younger generations, they've grown up with a completely different media landscape, haven't they?
Totally different. Not the three network dominance of the 70s.
No, they grew up in the fragmented, digital-first, social media-driven world we have today. So their experiences with news sources, their expectations of media, maybe even their definition of media, might be fundamentally different from older generations who came of age during that supposed golden age of objectivity we'll talk about later.
That makes sense. Their whole frame of reference is different.
Right. So this age gap within parties, especially among Democrats, adds another really important layer of complexity to the story. It's not just a simple Republican versus Democrat split. And the Gallup data does note, by the way, that most other institutions they survey also tend to get more trust from older adults than younger ones.
Are there exceptions?
Just two, according to Gallup: the legislative branch, Congress, and the judicial branch, Supreme Court. For those, there were no significant age differences in trust. But for most others, older Americans are generally more trusting.
Okay, so we've mapped the what's pretty clearly. Trust is low, it's deeply divided by party, with different trusted sources for each side, and there's also a significant age gap, especially among Democrats. The big question now is, well, why? How did we get here? How did the media landscape get so fragmented and distrusted, especially along these political lines? Because this decline in sorting, it didn't happen overnight.
No, it definitely didn't happen in a vacuum. And this is where that historical perspective offered in the PBS NewsHour piece, particularly the insights from Martha Minow, becomes absolutely essential. She provides this a crucial arc of how news media has transformed over time.
Okay, let's rewind the clock.
Yeah.
What was news like before this ideal of journalistic objectivity became the standard?
It's fascinating. Minow points out that if you go way back to the mid-1800s, the 1840s, 50s, 60s newspapers were actually funded directly by political parties.
Funded by the parties? Seriously?
Yeah. Their main purpose wasn't necessarily objective reporting as we think of it now. It was explicitly to promote the party's viewpoint. You were essentially getting your news directly filtered through a specific partisan lens.
That's a dramatically different model.
Yeah.
So when did this shift towards trying to be objective happen?
She describes the period roughly from the 1880s up into the 1960s as something of a, quote, golden age for the ideal of objectivity. This was really the first time that objectivity was elevated as the professional standard for journalism.
And why then? Was it just an ethical shift?
Well, it wasn't just an abstract ethical goal. It was actually intrinsically linked to the business model of the time.
How so? How did objectivity connect to the business side?
Well, the idea was that truly objective journalism, journalism that sought out multiple sources, that was transparent about its methods, provided documentation, presented counterpoints, that kind of journalism was actually good business. Why? Because it aimed for broad appeal.
Ah, okay. By being seen as fair and balanced.
Exactly. A newspaper or a broadcaster could attract the largest possible audience, the most eyeballs, and that in turn attracted more advertisers. And advertising revenue was the main thing paying the bills. So aiming for objectivity was both this ethical aspiration and a commercially viable strategy.
That makes a lot of sense. Maximize audience, maximize ad revenue. So what happened? What disrupted that model and that ideal?
Well, government regulation and, crucially, its later deregulation played a really key role, especially once broadcast media like television came onto the scene.
How did regulation factor in?
In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, television news was utterly dominated by just three major networks, right? CBS, ABC, NBC. That was basically it.
The big three.
Exactly. And because the airwaves were considered a public resource and there was such limited choice for viewers, the government stepped in to regulate broadcasters. The idea was to ensure fair treatment and presentation of diverse viewpoints on these powerful platforms.
And that's where the famous Fairness Doctrine comes in.
Precisely. Enacted back in 1949 by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the Fairness Doctrine basically required broadcasters to do two things. One, devote airtime to discussing controversial issues of public importance, and two, do so in a way that was honest, equitable, and balanced.
Balanced how?
Crucially, if one point of view on a controversial issue was presented, the broadcaster was required to also air a contrary point of view. It even included a right to reply provision for public officials if they were personally attacked on air.
So the government was actively using regulation to enforce balance and multiple perspectives, mainly because channel scarcity meant viewers didn't have many other options.
That was the logic. With only 3 network choices, you couldn't easily just flip the channel to get a different viewpoint if you didn't like what you were hearing. But then, things started to change dramatically in the 1980s with the explosion of cable television.
Right. Suddenly, there weren't just 3 channels, there were dozens, eventually hundreds.
Exactly. And as cable grew, the argument for that kind of government regulation started to weaken. The theory became, well, now viewers can simply change the channel if they want a different perspective. The marketplace of ideas can handle it.
And that shift in thinking led to the end of the Fairness Doctrine.
Yes. The regulatory framework shifted pretty fundamentally. President Reagan's FCC began phasing out the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. They argued it actually stifled free speech by making broadcasters cautious, and that it was simply no longer necessary in this new multi-channel environment.
And Martha Minow argues that this deregulation was a pivotal moment.
She does. She argues it really set the stage for the radical transformation we have seen in the news media landscape over the last few decades.
And that transformation moved us away from that broad appeal, objectivity-focused model towards what?
Towards what's often called narrowcasting. And alongside that, a much, much greater emphasis on opinion over straight news reporting.
Narrowcasting.
Yeah.
Meaning targeting specific, narrow audiences.
Exactly. With cable, and then later the internet, media outlets discovered they no longer needed to attract that massive, ideologically diverse audience to be profitable. They could actually be very successful by targeting smaller, more specific audiences, usually on the political left or the right, and catering directly to their existing viewpoints and preferences.
So instead of trying to be objective for everyone, they could be opinionated and cater to a specific group. And that could be a successful business model.
Precisely. And this shift aligns perfectly with what we saw in the Pew and Gallup data, right? That fragmentation into different media silos, with Republicans trusting Fox and Rogan, Democrats trusting a wider array of outlets, many of which are also seen, rightly or wrongly, as having a particular ideological bent.
It feeds the echo chambers.
It certainly can, and Martha Minow suggests this has fundamentally changed the reason why many people consume news. They're no longer primarily turning to media to, say, learn something entirely new or to be challenged on their beliefs. Instead, she argues, they're often seeking to be reinforced in what they already believe.
It becomes less about information gathering and more about identity affirmation.
That's a good way to put it. It's about confirming your existing worldview rather than necessarily exploring the full, messy picture.
And the source is mentioned an economic driver for this shift too, right?
Yeah.
Beyond just targeting audiences.
Yes. Minow points out that opinion-driven media is often significantly more successful financially than traditional, in-depth news journalism.
Why is that? Cheaper to make.
That's a big part of it. It's just less expensive to produce. Think about it. Opinion shows don't typically require the same level of investment in reporters traveling, conducting lengthy investigations, meticulous fact-checking, or dealing with the unpredictable nature of reporting where you don't know the outcome when you start.
Right. A host and guest talking in a studio is cheaper than funding investigative teams.
Much cheaper.
Wow.
So opinion programming is less costly to make, and it can be more effective at engaging that targeted, loyal audience we talked about.
How so? More effective.
Well, Minow suggests it's easier to take complex events or complicated stories and convert them into something, quote, very simple, digestible, and maybe even outraging.
Ah, outrage. That definitely gets attention.
Exactly. And in today's attention economy, especially online, outrage and simplicity are incredibly effective tools for capturing attention, generating clicks, shares, comments, driving engagement.
The PBS NewsHour transcript had a pretty clear example of this, didn't it? This idea of opinion-driven framing versus more traditional reporting, specifically around immigration and crime.
Yes, that was a really telling segment. It contrasted how some opinion shows, often on channels favored by one political side, might seize on terrible, isolated incidents involving immigrants.
Like a specific crime committed by an undocumented person.
Right, and frame that single incident, or a few incidents, as evidence of a widespread migrant-driven crime wave. They might focus solely on these awful cases without providing the broader statistical context about crime rates among immigrant populations versus native-born populations, or mentioning the overall economic or social contributions of immigrants.
So cherry-picking anecdotes to fit a narrative.
Essentially. And the piece contrasted that approach with an analysis by NBC News, which was cited as an example of more traditional reporting. NBC looked at the available crime data comprehensively and concluded there was, quote, no evidence of a migrant-driven crime wave, even while acknowledging that high-profile individual cases do occur.
So one approach focuses on anecdotes that stoke fear and confirm a bias. The other looks at broad data that tells a different story.
Precisely. And that comparison perfectly illustrates how this opinion framing model can select, emphasize, or de emphasize certain facts to reinforce a specific pre existing viewpoint or political narrative for its target audience, often without presenting the full context or strong counterpoints.
Okay, so this brings us squarely to the consequences of this landscape. The low trust, the deep partisan silos, the shift towards opinion and reinforcement. What do the sources say are the impacts?
Well, according to that PBS segment, based on survey data they cited, nearly three-quarters of Americans, almost 75%, believe the news media is actively making political polarization worse.
Wow, that's a powerful indictment coming from the public itself.
It really is. And there's research cited in the sources that seems to back this feeling up. Professor Matt Lewandowski, the political scientist interviewed by PBS.
Right, the one who studies polarization.
Yes. His research indicates that watching certain news channels does actually have a measurable impact on viewers' political opinions. It's not just correlation. He argues there's causation.
So it's not just that, say, conservatives watch Fox News. It's that watching Fox News might actually make viewers more conservative.
That's what his study suggests, yeah. He found that people tend to move politically in the direction of the source they consume, especially if that source is what he calls congenial to them, meaning it aligns with their existing political identity or preferences.
So it creates a kind of feedback loop.
Exactly. Consumption reinforces and potentially intensifies your existing political leanings, which might push people further out towards the polls, making compromise harder.
And Lewandowski also connected this media environment to the behavior of politicians themselves, didn't he?
He did. He made the important point that politicians often have their own incentives to divide people, right? To activate their base by emphasizing differences, by framing the other side negatively rather than seeking common ground.
Political strategy often thrives on division.
It can. And that political strategy interacts really powerfully with a media landscape that is already fragmented and already catering to these specific ideological audiences.
How does that play out? What did he observe?
Well, he noted the observation that candidates running for Congress, for instance, seem to be increasingly drawn from the political extremes of their parties rather than from more moderate positions in the middle.
The primaries often pull candidates to the edges.
Right. And as these more polarized politicians gain prominence and get more airtime, their messaging further contributes to what Lewandowski calls the stretching out of the public towards the political extremes. They reflect the polarization, sure, but their messaging, amplified through these congenial media channels, also reinforces and deepens it.
So it really does sound like a vicious cycle. Polarized politicians feed polarized media, which feeds polarized audiences, which then demands more polarized politicians and media content.
That seems to be the dynamic the sources describe.
What about the broader societal implications? Beyond just political squabbling, what are the deeper risks of this division and this lack of a shared understanding of reality?
This is where the sources raise some really profound concerns, touching on the health of democracy and society itself. Demet Hawk, the Democrat we heard from earlier in the PBS piece.
The immigrant from Turkey.
Yes, he expressed deep apprehension specifically about the spread of disinformation, particularly by certain outlets regarding the validity of election results.
He saw that as a direct threat to the system.
Absolutely. He explicitly called it a great risk to our democracy. And significantly, he drew a parallel to his home country, suggesting that similar divisions and the erosion of a shared reality, fueled by partisan media, contributed to the loss of democracy in Turkey.
That's a chilling comparison.
It is. His point is stark. If a significant portion of the population is being constantly told and comes to believe that fundamental democratic processes like elections are fraudulent or illegitimate, it strikes at the very foundation of the whole democratic system. How can it function?
And Martha Minow, the Harvard law professor, she echoed this concern, maybe on an even broader level.
She did. She described this lack of a shared reality as nothing short of a crisis in America right now. Her point is that if people are consuming information from completely different media ecosystems, they may not only be hearing different interpretations of the same facts,
They might actually be hearing entirely different sets of facts.
or even focusing on entirely different topics altogether with, as she put it, potentially no relationship between what one group is hearing and concerned about and what another group is hearing and concerned about.
Like that immigration example again, one side constantly hearing about a supposed crime wave, the other side hearing data showing no such wave, just completely different inputs.
Precisely. And her most I'd say, chilling warning is about the human consequence of this divergence. If people don't share a common understanding of basic facts, if they are constantly being fed narratives, particularly through partisan opinion media, that portray those with different political views not just as wrong, but as malicious, as dangerous.
As the enemy.
Yeah, as people who are, quote, out to get you. Then, she warns, it threatens not just the ability for democracy to function effectively, but potentially peaceful coexistence itself.
Wow. Peaceful coexistence. That's a fundamental level. The idea that this media fragmentation and polarization could undermine the basic ability for people with different beliefs to just live together in society without fundamental antagonism.
It's the most serious potential outcome that these sources raise. The PBS segment does briefly touch on some potential ways forward that Minnow mentions, things like maybe more funding for nonprofit media, supporting local journalism, which is often less polarized, finding ways to actively combat disinformation campaigns.
But did she sound particularly optimistic about finding easy answers? Did the sources offer a clear path out?
Honestly, no. The sources, particularly Minnow's comments, convey a sense of deep concern and the feeling that there are no simple solutions here. The problem is just so deeply rooted in these big historical shifts, powerful economic models, technological changes, and strong political incentives. It's not something easily fixed.
Okay, so let's try to pull together the main threads from this deep dive then. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
We've seen how, according to Gallup, Americans' trust in mass media is really languishing at a historical low. And critically, outright distrust now exceeds the combined level of those who have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence.
Right, and we saw how uniquely low media trust is compared to, say, local and state governments, although trust in many national institutions is also depressed compared to historical norms.
Then we really dug into that massive, pervasive partisan divide in media trust. That came through in Gallup, the PBS anecdotes, and especially the Pew data in the AP article.
Yeah, showing not just different levels of trust, but fundamentally different sets of trusted sources depending on your political affiliation. Republicans relying on a much narrower range, Democrats on a much broader one.
And we also flagged that significant age gap in trust, which was particularly pronounced within the Democratic Party, adding another layer of complexity.
Then we traced that historical path, understanding how the media shifted, from being party-funded way back to pursuing this ideal of objectivity, driven partly by a business model seeking broad appeal.
And then undergoing this radical transformation, fueled by deregulation, like the end of the Fairness Doctrine, the rise of cable and infinite channels, and the powerful economic incentives of narrowcasting and opinion-driven media that often focuses on reinforcing existing beliefs rather than broad, objective reporting.
And finally, we grappled with those really serious consequences highlighted in the PBS source. The public's own perception that media exacerbates polarization. Research suggesting media consumption actually can shift political views towards congenial sources.
And those stark warnings from experts like Demet Hawk and Martha Minow that this lack of shared reality, fostered by these media divides, poses a fundamental threat not just to political discourse, but potentially to democracy and even peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, the stakes feel incredibly high when you lay it all out like that.
It's just abundantly clear from these sources that understanding where people get their information and why they trust it, or maybe more importantly, why they don't trust it, is absolutely vital. It's crucial for making sense of the modern information environment and the intense political divisions we see all around us.
Right. The picture painted here is one where the media you consume isn't just, a matter of personal preference anymore. It can actively shape your understanding of reality and demonstrably contributes to these profound societal challenges we've been discussing.
And it forces that fundamental question, doesn't it, about the very purpose of news consumption for many people today. If the sources suggest this powerful drive towards reinforcement, towards confirming what you already think,
rather than a genuine desire to acquire new information or challenge one's existing perspective.
then maybe, given the stakes Martha Minow's crisis stemming from the lack of shared reality, maybe the biggest challenge we face today isn't just figuring out where to find trustworthy factual information.
Although that's certainly part of it.
Right, but maybe the even bigger challenge is figuring out how we can get people to be willing to engage with information that might not simply echo back what they already believe. How do we bridge those realities?
That really feels like the central and perhaps most difficult question these sources leave us with.